Hello, welcome to the series of tutorials for Kubernetes Basics for developers. This is the first part out of 6 of this fundamental tutorial series. My name is Rupam Hassan. I am a software engineer, architect, and I'm doing some research on container technologies. Over the years, I have had the opportunity to work with various technologies, and I am excited to discuss how you can expand your existing knowledge of containers while using Kubernetes. The goal of this series of tutorial is to share with you about the fundamentals of Kubernetes and the key resources it provides. Whether you are learning about Kubernetes for production or simply want to run it locally for testing or other scenarios, this course will provide the building blocks you need to get started. The introductory part of the series starts out by providing a big picture look at what Kubernetes is, what it's composed of, and different ways it can be used as a developer. One of the key resources provided by Kubernetes is pods. You learn what a pod is and how multiple pods can be used to host containers for an application. From there, you will learn about how to create pods using deployments, learn about creating services and how they can be used to provide networking functionality for your pods throughout a Kubernetes clusters. You will learn several storage options that provide by Kubernetes. Finally, you will learn also how to get configuration data into your application by using config maps and handle sensitive information by using secrets. So let's get started by talking about what Kubernetes is and the benefits it can bring you as a developer. Let's start things off by talking about what we are going to cover in this series of tutorial. We are going to start talking about Kubernetes, but from a developer's perspective. Why would you as a developer want to invest time learning Kubernetes? Well, you might already have a good reasons based on what you are doing at work. But if you don't, we will discuss several of benefits that knowledge of Kubernetes will help you as your current position at your company. We will discuss the overview of Kubernetes, the big pictures, the reasons to learn Kubernetes as a developer, benefit and uses, and so on. I'll show step-by-step guidelines to running Kubernetes locally. We'll show you how you get a start with KUBECTL, and we'll share the uses and installation of Web UI dashboard at the end of this part of this tutorial. Let's talking about Kubernetes from a developer's perspective. Now, if you are like me, you have probably heard about Kubernetes being used in production scenarios and maybe wondered, why would I even need to waste time on that? My DevOps team or someone else is going to handle that. Well, in this first module, I'm going to try to address some of these questions and talk about some scenarios where you might actually use Kubernetes in non-production environment. So to start things off, we are going to talk about Kubernetes from a high level. I will give you a quick overview. Then I will provide a visual explanation of some of the key players involved with Kubernetes. From there, we are going to talk about, as a developer, what are the benefits and some of the different use cases where I might care about Kubernetes. And then we will get into how to run Kubernetes locally, how to use a command line tool called KUBECTL, and then I am going to talk about how to get an extension of Kubernetes added in called the Web UI dashboard, which is a really great tool. And this would give you insight visually into what's going on with Kubernetes as well as the different containers that you are running. So let's jump into our Kubernetes overview. Now, first off, here's how they officially define it on their website. Kubernetes, or you will see KUBECTL as the abbreviation, is an open source system for automating deployment, scaling, and management of containerized application. So first, how are you managing your containers today? Let's say, for example, that you have set up a load balancer and that goes out to some different nodes, some virtual machines, or maybe even physical servers. And then on those servers, you have different containers running. Now, what are you going to do? Well, you would need some process that could monitor that and hopefully bring it back up. And there's a lot of issues that come into play if we talk about doing this on your own. Now take this a little further. Let's say that on your machine, you were using Docker Compose to do something like the following. So you had a server which called into some APIs, that calls into some databases, maybe SQL Server or MongoDB, and that's the application as a whole. Now, how would we manage all these containers? Well, locally we could use Docker Compose, and that would work very well. But how do we do this in production? And how are we going to update this later in production? We could use Docker Compose that would run in production, and it's not designed for that, but it would certainly work. Well, what happens when we need to scale this? We need to heal this if they go down, and there's a lot of other things like networking that can come into play too. So wouldn't it be nice if we could just package up an app and let something else manage it for us? Not worry about all the management of the containers. Eliminate single points of failure in our application. Scale containers easily. And update containers without actually even bringing down the running application. We'll talk about different ways to do that with something called deployments later. And then finally, we want a robust networking infrastructure so that containers can talk to other containers even across different machines. We might also need some storage options as well as with other machines. Well, all of these things I just mentioned can be done by Kubernetes, so you can think of it as a manager of a football team. The manager knows the game very well. He knows the different players, knows when they should start, if one of the players is sick, hopefully the managers can find somebody to fill in for them. And if you think of it from that standpoint, Kubernetes is the conductor of a container orchestra, and that's kind of how I like to think of it as. Some of the key features that this conductor can perform are shown here. First off, we can discover different services that are available within our Kubernetes cluster. We are going to call it a group of machines working together to run our different containers. Load balancing can also take place within Kubernetes. Things like storage, and if you have done Docker much, you have heard of Docker volumes. Think of that here. It can also be orchestrated across one or more machines in Kubernetes cluster. As we deploy our applications, we can do a zero downtime deployment where a new app can be rolled out without actually taking down the previous app. And that alone can be worth its weight in gold if you have thought that before in production scenarios. If a container go down, as I just described earlier, there's a self-healing features that can automatically bring up that container. How cool is that? Things like secrets, configuration, and other things of settings that we need to store for our Kubernetes cluster that maybe our different containers need and the applications in those containers. Those can be stored in a secrets area, and we also have something called config maps we are going to discuss that can be used to store key value pairs. Another things Kubernetes can do is horizontally scale our containers. So if one particular container is kind of overloaded, but the machine still has more power available such as memory and CPU, we can actually horizontally scale out those. Now I pick these 6 key features available. There's even more it does, but from a developer standpoint, these are definitely 6 things that we would like to have, and they are things we are going to be talking about as we move throughout this module and others in the courses. Kubernetes, the way it works is you will have one or more master nodes, and think of this is the boss of the operation that knows how to manage the different employees, which we are going to call worker nodes. The worker nodes can be physically servers. Most often these days they are virtual machines, but together they create a cluster. Now that the master will do is start something on each of these nodes called pods. A pod, as you are going to see in a moment, is really just a way to host a container. Now, a pod itself is really just the packaging, the box for the product. So if you go to the store and pull a box from a shell, you're not going to run the box. You're going to open it and run whatever product is inside from the box. That's exactly what pods do, and we can have many pods if we would like on a given machine. That's where Kubernetes comes into play for horizontally scaling pods, for example. Now pods don't exist in their own. There's other things that are needed to support them within Kubernetes. So while you could have many pods running containers on your different nodes of a Kubernetes cluster, you're going to need a way to deploy the pods. So we will be talking about something called deployments, and replica sets later. In the course, you'll also need a way to enable pods communicate possibly with the outside world or just among themselves within the cluster, and that would be done through something called Kubernetes service. So these are different types of resources that can be used to make sure that our pods are being deployed properly, that they're running, that the containers within them are healthy, and much more. A node, as mentioned earlier, is really just a virtual machine, we will say in this case. And it can run on or more pods as mentioned. The way the master nodes of Kubernetes communicate to these worker nodes is shown here. We are going to have something called etcd store on our master nodes, and kind of think of this is the database for everything the master node need to track, and the boss needs to track for our cluster. We're also going to have a controller manager, and this will be responsible for when a request comes in, the manager can act upon the request and schedule it using a scheduler. Just like this. Now the scheduler will determine when the nodes and the different pods running on the nodes actually come to life or go away or whatever it may be. Now we as developers or DevOps or any sort of IT admin folks can interact with the master to give it instructions to go from one state to another by using command line tool called KUBECTL. It's just a command line tool that we can use to send different requests into the master, and those requests can be scheduled to run on our different nodes within the cluster. You will see that we can send through YAML. We are going to be talking about what that is about, and also we can talk about JSON if needed to. But these are metadata files that we can send to the API server, and the API server is just a RESTful service. KUBECTL is just making your different type of RESTful service calls to send these before and after a state request to the master. From there, the master is going to communicate using the tools I just mentioned earlier with the different nodes. Now each node, in addition to have the pods running, obviously needs a way to communicate back and forth to the master. So it has a little agent installed that's running on each node that registers that node with the cluster and reports back and forth to the manager. That is called kubelet. We also need container runtime, of course, to run our containers within the pods. And then we need networking capabilities, and we have something called a kubeproxy that can ensure that each pod gets an unique IP address. And this will tie into the services that I have mentioned a little bit earlier. So that's a quick overview of the different building blocks of Kubernetes. But these are key things that you need to know right up front just to get started. So now that we have covered some of the different building blocks and players of Kubernetes, let's jump into the benefits of use cases of Kubernetes, but from a developer's perspective. Before getting into Kubernetes, I ask the question, why do I need this? I am a developer. I don't typically deal with the production setup of networking or servers or anything like that. And if I am using the cloud, there's a lot of options out there that will run containers. So why do you need Kubernetes? And I think that's a valid question to ask actually as a developer. First off, we need to know that locally I can get others up to the speed very quickly. Could be new hires, contractors or other folks on the team, because we could use something like Docker Compose to get an entire environment up and running, and then even use volumes to talk back to our local file system. We can eliminate app conflicts and run multiple versions at the same time of that app very easily, because we could have different containers. A consistent environment where my code truly does work on my machine and in production and QA and whatever other environments you may have. And then, of course, we know containers just ship software faster. Now, all of that's great, but what if your company has now decided to take it to the next level and they are going to run Kubernetes? Well, that one use case, probably the most obvious use case ever, the reason you want to learn these whole Kubernetes topics. But there are some others we are going to talk about in a moment. Now, as far as the Kubernetes benefits, especially to us as developers, here's a few things to think about. It will orchestrate our containers. Okay, that's very nice. We have Docker Compose, of course, but we know that's mainly for local scenarios. So if we want in production, then we could use Kubernetes for that. Really big one is zero downtime deployments, and we are going to talk about this in our later series of this tutorial. But if you have ever stayed up until like 2 a.m. in the morning or 4 a.m. in the morning, or maybe just were there 24 hours straight at work for the deployment, then this is pretty phenomenal actually. It also has self-healing powers, almost like superpowers. One of the containers goes down, it's like all right next. It's like all right, next person up. Who is next? Come help us out. Or hey you, yeah, I'm talking to you. Come help us out. And it can actually bring up a new container and replace the one or ones that were sick or ailing. That's pretty cool, right? Another thing is we can scale our containers very easily horizontally. So if I want to add more pods with containers on a given node, with just some simple command, I can change the state of the Kubernetes cluster to add these additional pods and containers and so on. Now, as far as developer use cases, so why would we as developers want to learn Kubernetes? Well, the most obvious one that I have already mentioned is that you need to actually work like production on your local machine and test your environment as you wish. You could use Docker Compose all you want, but Docker Compose doesn't have all the features of Kubernetes. So if you really want to run your app locally and try it out, then this is a good reason. Maybe you do nothing with production except try to emulate that environment on your machine. Well, we can do that. It's also a big move from Docker Compose to Kubernetes if your company is using that in production, and so well address why we need to learn about things like pods and containers and deployments and replica sets, services and more. What about creating an end-to-end testing environment? Let's say that you would like to bring up the exact environment for production, but now you are going to use an end-to-end testing tool. Could be Selenium based, maybe Cypress.io or something like that. We could do that with Kubernetes. How do you know if your application actually is going to work as different pods and containers are added and we scale out horizontally? Have you actually tested that? It's one thing to assume, and if your app is truly stateless, it probably will work fine. But it's always a good thing to actually validate that. And so whether it's in local development or maybe on a staging Kubernetes cluster, we could need to be able to know about that and know how it works. How about secrets and configuration? Are they being loaded properly across different containers that might be in our app? Maybe we're using Kubernetes to deploy multiple microservices, and we want to make sure that the different config for each of those or any secret are being loaded appropriately. Performance testing. We might want to see what are the limits of our application in a Kubernetes cluster. So to do that, we need to know things like how to scale out, how to scale back, and we can now turn our test against different scenarios. You can even use Kubernetes for your build server. Maybe you have multiple builds across different technology products that you release, and you want to do that using Docker containers, which I highly recommend as part of the CI/CD pipeline. By doing that, number one, I can easily swap out different containers in the future as new versions of my tech product come out. But also, now when with the Kubernetes, we could have a bunch of these orchestrated so that if one of them crashes and goes down during the build process, Kubernetes can just bring that up so that the future request to the pipeline keep working properly. We might also want to learn how to leverage different deployment options. We are going to talk about the zero downtime deployment I mentioned, but you can do something called canary testing, A to B, or blue-green testing, all kinds of ways to make sure your app is actually going to work properly in production. And Kubernetes can make that a lot easier. And then finally, you might just be in that role where you have to help out DevOps or IT admin or whatever you call them at your job. And as a problem comes up in production with your application, you might need to help them troubleshoot what's actually going on. Well, if you don't know anything about Kubernetes, that's going to be a little bit challenging. Later in this series of tutorial, as we talk about the different parts of the Kubernetes, you are going to understand that. Now, okay, so now are there more use cases than this? Absolutely. But these are some of the key ones that various companies using today or that you might need to use in the future. And I think these are good reasons to actually take the time to learn Kubernetes. So let's make our environment ready. To use Kubernetes, we obviously need a way to run it. So we are going to take a look at several options that allow you to run Kubernetes locally on your machine. And that way you can emulate as simple as a single master and a single node, or there's even options where you could do multiple and scale out if you would like. So to install and run Kubernetes, there's different options out there. Minikube, has been around for a long time and provides a really easy way to get Kubernetes cluster up and running on your development machine. Now it does have some limitations like the next one I'm going to talk about, which is our Docker desktop. In that you can't just scale out like a production on, but it does provide the full functionality of KUBECTL, and you will have your master node and worker node to work with. You can get instructions at the GitHub site and it's pretty straightforward to get going. Now the one I am going to be using throughout this series of tutorial is Docker desktop, mainly because of all the ones I will mention. It's by far the easiest to get Kubernetes going on. You're probably going to have Docker anyway on your machine, and this is a matter of just a checkbox to get Kubernetes installed. Now you have to do now you have a limitation of one so means like you have a limitation like you only have one master node and one worker node, but to do just a normal Kubernetes pods and deployments and services and things like that, this will also get the job done. You can learn, you can practice, and you can replicate your production to your local and so on. And as mentioned, that's what I will be using throughout the demos in this series of tutorial. Now if you would like the ability to scale out your worker nodes, you can use Kubernetes in Docker. This is fairly straightforward to get going on your machine, and it's certainly an option you can get explore. You can get more information at the website. Now if you would like to install the full Kubernetes, you can use kubeadm. This is something that is outside of this series of tutorial and would be targeted more towards administrators of a Kubernetes cluster. So now that we have talked about that, let's discuss how on Docker desktop we can get Kubernetes up and running very quickly. Alright, so first thing I had to do is set Docker desktop installed as mentioned earlier and get it up and running. Now once the Docker desktop is up and running, now we can check if the Kubernetes is already installed or not. Sometimes if your Docker desktop run and then if you see here in the orange color, that means it's not up and running and having some issues. So to fix that, you maybe can go for a reset factory defaults, or maybe you try to restart your Docker desktop. Alright, to install the Kubernetes, which as I am using the Windows machine, so I will be showing how it works in Windows. Alright, so we need to go to the settings, and here in the left side you'll find the Kubernetes option. So only thing you need to do is you just click here, enable Kubernetes, and then apply restart. So it will install the Kubernetes clusters in our Docker machine. So let's click on install. This will take some time, right? So once it is done, up and running, you see now it's installing, already started. So once it is up and running, we will come back. Alright, so our Kubernetes already installed to our Docker container. You can see Kubernetes is up and running and already green color. Let's go for a quick check. So for that, we will open our PowerShell and we will check our first kubectl command line. Okay, so let's type kubectl get all. Yep, so you can see already on service up and running. Alright, that means our Kubernetes installation is successful. Let's get going. As you work with Kubernetes, you will need to get good at this KUBECTL command line tool, and we are going to look at a few of these basic commands to help you get you started here. So earlier we talked about how KUBECTL can interact with an API and the master node, and then that can cause the controller manager and then the scheduler to perform different actions on the nodes. Some of the key ways to get started with KUBECTL are going to be shown here. I'm not going to focus on them right now, but I will run a few of them to get started. And slowly during this series of tutorial, you will see all the commands we will be using progressively. So let's get started. We already have seen this KUBECTL get all. Now I'll show you some more. You'll see this KUBECTL version. For example, in the left side you will see there are a list of commands I already added for this course purpose. So like say you type KUBECTL and version, so it will give us the version number. For our case is 4.5.7. Then you can have the cluster information like KUBECTL cluster info. Then we can have KUBECTL create or KUBECTL apply, and so on. So then we will execute all this progressively. Let's do a quick tricks for reducing the typing the KUBECTL. So we are going to do some alias for this KUBECTL. It's a long word. So to do that in the PowerShell, we can do this way. So set alias name K, for instance, and for which keyword you will using CTL. So this will replace our KUBECTL with alias K. So now already set. Now let's try if this works or not. So K get all. Perfect. That works fine. All right. Let's move into the next chapter. Alright, so now it's time to install our web UI dashboard. So to install that, basically you can follow the instructions from the Kubernetes official site itself. So if you go to this URL, you will find the list of steps that you need to follow for running the web UI dashboard in your local. The first thing is, what you need to do is you need to copy this whole bunch of URL and paste it in your PowerShell or whichever command line you are using, and then you need to run this KUBECTL proxy. But before that, you need to get a token to give the access to your dashboard. Then you can follow from there providing a steps. So you can go the creating a simple users. I already opened it. So here if you follow all the steps here, basically it will creating admin users and the role, and then given the permission to that, and then what is happening is just providing a token by running this command in your KUBECTL. But since it is giving the admin rights, so please make sure whenever you do not need, you can disable it, or at the end you will see you can delete this role and admin users as well. Okay, so after I follow their steps, so now our dashboard looks like this. But since I do not have any service or pods or deployments up and running, it's pretty much empty, my dashboard. We will look through in future models when we will have some more pods, deployments and service up and running. Alright, cheers. Alright, so that's all for today's first part of this 6 series tutorial. So let's summarize what we have done so far. So we have shown some Kubernetes provides container orchestration capabilities, user production, emulation and production, testing, and much more. How you can use for CI/CD and all those. Then I have shown you the pods, then the nodes, and all those. Then several options are available to run Kubernetes locally. And then we have shown you how you can install the web UI dashboard and how it looks like. And also we have done some portion of interaction with the Kubernetes using KUBECTL, and we have covered a lot of theories, concepts, that why a developer should learn Kubernetes and so on. Let's get going. Then the future modules and the future parts of this tutorial all will be hands-on and all. All right, cheers. Thank you for watching.